Where are you calling from?
Is this me?
Yes, it is you. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
I am Alacrity from Alabama, and I shall be swift. I watched...
Alacrity from Alabama.
Yes.
Swift Alacrity, okay?
Yes, so I watched your Yaron versus Seder debate. I watched the debate. And I just wanted to ask you a point. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's Yaron, I believe is how you pronounce his name.
Oh, well, forgive me. Anyway, I watched the debate, and there was this one point that there were several points, but the one that stood out to me the most was when you were addressing slavery with him, and you mentioned how you had interviewed several authors about slavery and about how it was largely responsible for the economic boons experienced by various countries around the world, developed what are now developed countries that were developing then, from slavery and the slave triangle, like Matt said. So I just wanted to say that I think that is a bit, I don't know who the authors you spoke to were, but I think that is a bit of an oversimplification, given the fact that slavery, while yes, it can be used to generate capital formation, it does have several detrimental effects technologically and industrially. In fact, it's the abundance of slave labor that can actually inhibit technological advancement. And I have empirical evidence for this. Would you like me to detail it? I have some data.
No. I mean, the idea that if I have free labor, an endless supply of free labor to pick cotton, so I don't have to develop a mechanized cotton picker, yeah, I mean, that doesn't seem terribly profound to me.
Well, I see, but what is the point then when you say that slavery that slavery was a driving force of industrialization, economic growth? Then, when you say that, because the driving force behind economic.
Here's what I would say: like tobacco in Virginia would not have been possible without slavery, without plantation slavery. And so, whether it had later effects on depressing industrial development or whatever, it's just not. It gave you the chance to do it. That's where those profits came from. Those profits were not possible without slavery.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not even sure what the point of saying, like, well, on day one, because slavery is involved there, that, I mean, if your argument is, hey, these folks were idiots because they went for the low-hanging fruit of enslaving people and getting free labor, and that's the way that they created the economic engine. They could have probably made 15 to 20% more had they waited a couple of years for somebody to invent a cotton picker.
But they invented with the profits.
Of course. And let's be clear here, like, the option of a plantation owner to, go and buy slaves or wait until someone invents a machine that picks up. Like, I don't even understand do I think that the existence of free labor that is far more accessible to everybody than machines that hypothetically might exist in the future were there not free labor? I'm not even sure of, like, aside from that not being terribly profound, what is the point of that? What does that have to do with the argument that we had with Yaron?
Well, a few things earlier. As you said earlier, that if my argument is that, well, they just should have waited for more inventions, no, I must say that is a mischaracterization. As how it relates back to Yaron, I'm not even sure what your point was in bringing it up in the first place, given that. And second of all, I didn't
bring up slavery. He did.
I
see, but you also brought up the fact that you would... I know, but...
The labor is it's easy to attribute, like ownership, and it's definitely not.
Right.
So this entire continent is that is not the case.
I know that, Mr. Seder, but you...
White people were brought over here in bondage too soon in those places, too mainly to balance out the black demography.
Well, first of all, Mr. Seder, I wanted to mention that if you... again, as I said, I was addressing specifically when you defended it after Yaron had got done saying his bit. You then came in and said with the author, that you had interviewed like half a dozen authors, and you had said that was the case. But the thing is that the research is actually mixed on the.
Refuting my point.
No, I'm not. I wasn't finished yet, Mr. Seder.
If they didn't use slavery, that's a hypothetical that could be possible.
Well, no, it isn't.
The point is, they free labor did drive the development of a cotton industry, or in the case of Virginia, a tobacco industry. It did provide opportunities for bankers in the North to finance and support.
Early parts in the North were like servicing those ships. That's what did some turpentine from Boston, right? That's what those ports were important for, because the real money wasn't getting slaves to the Caribbean and sugar and rum out of there.
Yes, I mean, I don't know. The idea that if I start a YouTube channel and I get a bunch of views and I monetize it, well, that may be the case, but you haven't optimized it. Well, okay, so there's room for me to make 20% more. I mean, even if I stipulate what you're talking about, which I will for the sake of argument, because I find it a completely irrelevant argument, what is your point?
My point is that you've grossly overstated the role that it played. For example, some studies say that it's only responsible for about 5 to 13% of the capital formation. And in fact, the role of slavery is even more detrimental to economic development because, for example, if you look at the... I wasn't finished yet, Mr. Cedar. Mr. Cedar. Mr. Cedar. I wasn't finished. Mr. Cedar. I was not unable to hear what Matt... I believe that's Matt. I don't know who that was, but I was unable to hear what he's...
saying that you are not accounting... You're looking at hypothetical...
No, I wasn't finished yet, Mr. Cedar. I was not finished yet. Forgive me.
Explain to you what he's saying.
Well, I wasn't finished. I'm trying to explain, Mr. Cedar.
That are telling you that there could have been a greater return if they didn't use slaves and they developed technology. And Matt is telling you, look at history, look at the way that people organize themselves. Look at where the sources of revenue and economic activity were happening. And you can see that they would import a bunch of slaves. Now, maybe they weren't doing it efficiently enough, and maybe I overstated the percentage in which people... But the absence of technology, because slavery may have inhibited technology's growth, doesn't in any way contradict the notion that the economy and that slavery drove all this economic activity.
But yes, it does, because if it's only responsible for about 5 to 13% of capital formation, you aren't accounting for the other factors. For example, if you look at the roots of the Industrial Revolution, you actually find that there is an incentive for industrialization where wages were higher. For example, in Britain, for workers, I wasn't finished yet, Mr. Cedar.
Listen, by the way, here's why I'm interrupting you.
No, Mr. Cedar, why don't you...
I don't care. I mean,
why?
Even if you are 100% right, let me stipulate, you're 100% right. I grossly overstated the amount that slavery, it was just more of like there was no economic incentive for anybody to maintain slaves. It was more of just like a hobby.
They hated black people that much.
It was a hobby, and it was just out-and-out racism. What's your point?
My point is... My point is that when you talk about slavery in relation to capitalism, often, as in the context that you're referring to it, you're drawing implications from it, economic implications from it, that are simply flawed when you overstate the amount as all them staying. For example, as I was saying, if you look at the roots of the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't slavery that was the driving factor. I wasn't finished yet, Mr. C.
I honestly don't care.
Well, why not? Because slavery was not a driving factor. Because slavery exists.
There's two opinions about slavery. One is that it drove economic activity, and the other opinion is yours, that it's just about specifically wanting to imprison people from Africa and get their free labor because it was more of like a hobby, or maybe it was a status symbol or something like that. Either way, it doesn't really, I mean, I guess in your mind, it protects criticism of capitalism and a critique of capitalism. But then I would say, like, well, people are accumulating too much money if that's what their hobby was. Well, I would say that we need to have confiscatory taxation so that we cannot develop such hobbies that would lead to the brutalization and the enslavement.
Most hobbies don't. Most hobbies are like collecting baseball cards. It doesn't necessarily. No, I guess they do accumulate, or playing fantasy football doesn't mean that you're accumulating wealth and enslaving people.
Well, Mr. Seder, this is what you stated. My opinion was that people just did it as a hobby. No, that's a gross mischaracterization. There is plenty of room for irrationality in economic behavior. My point is that if you look, slavery existed. Mr. Seder, I was not finished yet.
I mean, look, dude, go read about the Industrial Revolution. Go read about, like...
I have, Mr. Seder. I'm providing you the data. If you allow me to provide the...
Slaves that are imported as the ability for technology to weave the cotton.
That isn't my own...
The cotton.
That is not the only thing that I was stating. As I'm trying to state, slavery existed almost everywhere in world history. It's existed for thousands of years. So slavery was not the driving factor. But if you look at places where the Industrial Revolution occurred, and you look at wage rates, for example, in Britain before the Industrial Revolution, one of the... no, Mr. I'm trying... Mr. Seder, this is...
conversation I could imagine. It has nothing to do with the
It does,
conversation
Mr.
I had
Seder, and I'm
with
trying
you.
to explain, Mr.
Nothing
Seder.
to do
May I
with
please
anything.
explain?
I don't understand what your point is. Tell
I'm
me
trying
your
to
point.
explain, but I keep getting interrupted, Mr. Seder. Anyway, as I was saying, slavery existed everywhere in the world and existed for thousands of years. So you need to look at what makes places different if you want to see if you want to understand the causes for new events like the Industrial Revolution. And there's empirical evidence that high wages, which existed in Britain, for example, in Britain, wages per day for workers were about 11 grams of silver per day, where in India or China, they were only about 3 or 4 grams of silver per day. So my point is that, no...
All right. I'm sorry, you've been on the phone for 11 minutes, and if you haven't...
Well, okay. So I tried to explain to Mr. Seder that his views about slavery are highly simplistic. And the point of my trying to point out that you need to look at the places that are different when looking at the causes of the Industrial Revolution and other things. You need to look at what incentivizes certain types of phenomena. For example, mechanization. There is plenty of empirical evidence that high wages influence more technological development. So he was strawmanning me earlier when he said, well, they should have just waited for that. No, that's not the argument. The argument isn't that they should have been able to recognize that. That's absurd. And it's just a gross misrepresentation of my position or any other position on the issue, which is what I was trying to press. Because he stated in the debate that he's interviewed about half a dozen authors and that slavery was integral, that it allowed for the Industrial Revolution. When no, that's an absurd view of history. Perhaps in some cases, if you look at the studies, if you read about the Industrial Revolution, some studies find that yes, it's responsible for a fair portion of capital formation. But you're going to draw flawed conclusions from that when you try to actually analyze when you analyze history in such a biased manner, because that's not the only thing. Slavery existed everywhere for thousands of years, and it existed in places like India and China and other places. I don't know if that's specifically in the time frame at that point, but slavery existed almost everywhere for thousands of years. But what catalyzed the Industrial Revolution is evolving conditions that made it different. For example, there's this one study from phys.org that found that changing environmental conditions made it more sustainable to have less children and invest more in each child. That was another cause of the Industrial Revolution. So my point is that when he talks about slavery and relates it to capitalism and talks about how capitalism may have propagated slavery or or even if he concedes that it simply that slavery was simply subsumed under capitalism, that doesn't mean that capitalism is associated with slavery. So my point is that this is a common leftist argument. My point is that, yes, he has overstated the role of slavery in the Industrial Revolution. And to advance this, look even further. Yaron of Alexandria, he invented an analog to a steam engine. But it never caught on, really, even though it was very, very similar to a steam engine. And there's likely several reasons for this. For example, there was plenty of slavery in ancient Greece and all the city-states, so the labor was free, so there's no incentive to invest in labor-saving devices or new technology. So the point is that slavery creates a disincentive for this kind of development. It's not that people should have recognized that. No, that's completely absurd. That's a mischaracterization of any position on this issue. So no, my point is that that slavery is not nearly as important as Seder implied when discussing that in the Yaron debate. and that is evidenced by the continued straw manning of the position. And also, a lack of intellectual property is likely another reason for why Yaron's inventions, such as the steam engine, did not take hold. Lack of commercialization. And there is plenty of empirical evidence for all of this. So when he said that you need to read more about the Industrial Revolution and history, with all due respect, I think Seder may need to do more from the other side, perhaps. I was going to recommend some reading materials, but perhaps for another time. Anyway, signing off.